Hey everyone, welcome to podcast number 12, Imperialism from 1890 to 1913. Topics to be covered today are going to be causes of imperialism, Alaska, Hawaii, the Spanish-American War, Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so first of all, imperialism, what is it? You should know this from hopefully, AP World History or whatever, but imperialism, just to kind of refresh, is the economic and political domination of a strong nation over weaker nations. Okay, it becomes quite the trend in Europe, in the 19th century. And America also catches the fever and also begins to act like an imperialist nation. Okay, so what caused imperialism? Okay, there's a bunch of things that are always kind of brought up. There's still a lot of the historical debate as to why did the United States become this imperialist nation. Okay, so you have reasons such as religion. Okay, spreading of Christianity to the heathens has sometimes been brought up. In fact, McKinley himself, when he does decide to go ahead and stay in the Philippines after the Spanish-American War, one of his motivations is to spread Christianity. Okay, there's also this idea called the white man's burden, which is kind of like a different form of manifest destiny, kind of like it's God has given us the duty, or given the American people the duty to spread civilization around the world, to spread democracy around the world. So, basically that when we take over an inferior nation, we're doing them a favor because, we're teaching them how to be civilized. So there's that. There's also this idea about new markets, which we'll talk about in the next slide. And another reason I think too is this idea of manliness. This idea that at this time, for whatever reason, there's just a lot of aggressive politicians out there. A lot of the people that fought the Civil War are now, kind of gone and not in charge anymore. And you have this new generation of Americans that are a little bit more aggressive. They don't remember the horrors of war and stuff like that. And so they're going to be much more likely to want to go ahead and jump into imperialism a little bit. Desire for new markets is definitely an interesting idea. Basically, during the Industrial Revolution, industry is booming, agriculture is booming, and so this massive increase in production. And so a lot of these industrialists, these business leaders, are going to want America to expand its markets, to find more people to buy our stuff. And so imperialism was kind of an answer to overproduction and unemployment. Okay, so that's one theory. Okay, other reasons for imperialism is now that we're becoming more of a, international power. Now that we're starting to trade with other nations on a large scale, you need to protect your trade routes, and so as a result, you need these strategic locations for your navy. And so, one of the reasons that we go after Hawaii or Midway Island or, some of these places like the Philippines after the Spanish-American War is because they provide great naval bases for our Navy to protect our interest, our growing interest overseas. So there's lots of reasons why perhaps we did become imperialistic, okay? But the three imperialist actions I want to look at today are going to be Alaska, Hawaii, and the Spanish-American War. And really, I don't think maybe Alaska shouldn't be called imperialistic, but it definitely shows our interest in expansion. So in 1867, we basically buy Alaska from Russia for a cool $7.2 million, which today sounds laughable, but at the time, actually, Seward was made fun of because people thought it was just kind of like just this wasteland. And clearly, it has proven to not be a wasteland. So that's a good move. It shows that, once again, we're interested in expanding westward. The annexation of Hawaii is a great example of the growing American aggressiveness of the time. Essentially, Hawaii is independent. They have a king and they have a queen, but eventually the growing American power of business owners in this region are too much for the royal family of Hawaii to resist. And sometimes you can't just make this stuff up, but you have some wealthy business owners led by a Mr. Dole. So if you like yourself some pineapple juice, they still have the Dole juice growers and stuff. Basically, these business owners, with the help of U.S. Marines, actually overthrow the Queen, and I'm not even going to try to say her name because I can't. And basically, they create a republic in 1894. And the United States eventually does annex Hawaii in 1898. President Cleveland refused to do so in 1894, but President McKinley in 1898 most definitely does. Okay. So, anyways, moving on to like the main event of our era of imperialism here is the Spanish-American War. Okay, where we go to war with Spain. There's a bunch of reasons why we do. Okay, there's the Cuban independence, there's U.S. investments in Cuba, there's yellow journalism, and there's the USS Maine. We'll talk about each one of these real briefly, but I think the bottom line, and hopefully you're kind of getting this throughout American history, is that there are a couple moments in American history where we seem like no matter what happens, we're looking for a fight. And I think the Spanish-American War is a great example of that many Americans just want this war. Spain's an easy target, so let's take them out kind of thing. We'll find a reason to fight these guys. Okay, but one of the first causes that's usually talked about the Spanish-American War is this push for Cuban independence. The Cubans are rebelling against the Spanish. The Spanish are trying to put down the rebellion, but it's incredibly brutal. They have actually these called these reconcentration camps where they put some of these Cubans in there and try to get them to maybe re-educate them, I guess. And hundreds of thousands of Cubans are dying. American businesses are getting destroyed, and so American public opinion begins to lean towards these Cubans that are fighting for their independence. Okay, we try to actually buy Cuba from Spain, and at one point, but Spain actually says we'd rather see Cuba sink into the ocean, and so these Cubans are rebelling, and Americans are going to start to support them more and more. And one of the reasons they support them more and more is because of yellow journalism. You have these New York newspapers and other newspapers around the country that are basically like sensationalizing the Cubans' quest for independence. Okay, they're making stuff up. They're mainly focused on selling newspapers, so they're going to try to exaggerate as much as possible to get people to want to buy their newspapers. In fact, one of these yellow journalists is actually quoted as saying, "You furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war." And so basically the Spanish-American War, many people suggest, is actually caused by these yellow journalists. So it's almost kind of like one of the plots for a James Bond movie. But anyways, other things the yellow journalists do, they obviously sensationalize the USS Maine being blown up. They also sensationalize the Delome letter, which is a letter from a Spanish ambassador back to Spain, mocking McKinley, calling him weak. Anyways, the USS Maine does blow up in Havana Harbor. It's visiting Cuba. It blows up. At the time, no one knows why, but these yellow journalists basically make it up that it was destroyed by the enemy's secret infernal machine. And Hearst offers $50,000 to capture the Spaniards. We found out later, by the way, later in the 20th century, that it was one of our coal furnaces actually just blew up, and so the Spanish had no part in it whatsoever. So when this happens, the American people get all revved up, thinking that, the Spanish have attacked us, let's go get them kind of thing. And war is imminent, okay? 1898, McKinley asked Congress to declare war. It's going to be a two-front war. We're going to fight in the Pacific and Cuba, all right? President or future President Theodore Roosevelt was Secretary of the Navy at the time, Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time. He had, on his own, ordered American forces to prepare for war before war was actually declared. And so when war is declared, our Navy is sitting outside the Philippines and one morning just kind of strolls into the harbor and sinks the Spanish fleet basically where it was sitting. Okay, and so the Philippines, for the most part, are under American control immediately. The Americans also launch an invasion of Cuba. It's not the most organized invasion in the world. In fact, it's very unorganized. But we're able to invade Cuba. The only notable day of the war is when the Rough Riders storm San Juan and Kettle Hill, taking key positions in Cuba. The Spanish resistance quickly fades, but this is important because this is going to give Theodore Roosevelt kind of this hero status, which he'll then use to launch his political career and further become governor of New York and eventually vice president and then president. But anyways, the war ends pretty quickly. John Hay, our Secretary of State, calls it a splendid little war. We get Guam, we get Puerto Rico, We get the Philippines, all for around $20 million, and Spain agrees to free Cuba, which we will carefully watch over the next couple decades. But you can see over here in this map, it shows all these islands that the United States is kind of collecting now. And they're all very little, obviously, but I'm sure you can guess why they're so important. They're all very strategic naval bases for the United States to spread its influence throughout the Pacific Ocean. Okay, here's a great political cartoon of the time that critiques imperialism. It's important to note that not all Americans were for imperialism, but there was a lot of people that thought it was very kind of anti-American. And speaking of anti-American, the Anti-Imperialist League gets set up shortly after the Spanish-American War, and it includes prominent Americans like Mark Twain and Andrew Carnegie, people that are basically saying, hey, look, how can we take over how can we take over Cuba? How can we take over the Philippines here? Because that's very un-American. We used to be colonies. We didn't want to be controlled by these people way across the ocean, and yet here we're doing this. So this is very un-American. We need to stop. So anyways, we see America kind of controlling, or trying to set up an empire, I should say, in Cuba. We say the Cubans are free, but we make them put the Platt Amendment in their constitution, which gave the U.S. the right to intervene in Cuban affairs at any time for any reason. The Cubans also give us Guantanamo Bay, which we still have, rather infamously, by the way. And Filipino resistance is one of the sadder chapters of this period. The Filipinos feel betrayed by the Americans. The Filipinos thought that we were there to help them become independent of Spain. However, once we have gotten the Philippines, we turn them into a colony, we take them under our control, and we basically forcefully keep them under our control in a brutal civil war where 4,500 American troops are killed, and also hundreds of thousands of Filipinos are killed in the fighting. The Philippines will stay under American control all the way up until World War II, where we actually lose it to the Japanese, and then we get it back, and then we free the Philippines eventually, shortly after World War II. Okay. Anyways, Roosevelt becomes president when McKinley gets assassinated. He's oftentimes considered one of our imperialist presidents, as long as being a progressive president. But Roosevelt has a very aggressive foreign policy. It's usually considered like big stick diplomacy or something like that. He's very famous for saying, speak softly but carry a big stick. So the United States under Roosevelt is going to assert itself in world affairs, especially in Latin America. We're going to get very, very involved in Latin America. In fact, Roosevelt's going to add something to the Monroe Doctrine. He's going to add what's known as the Roosevelt Corollary, which is basically going to say that the United States has the right to intervene in the affairs of any Latin American nation if we feel it in some way harms U.S. interests or it's going to bring Europe into the Western Hemisphere. So the United States becomes kind of like a police force in Latin America. And this is going to make Latin American nations look down upon America, call us the bad neighbor, call us the colossal of the North, and so it's going to create a lot of bad blood between the U.S. and many Latin American nations that one could argue still exist today. Roosevelt is also very famous for the Panama Canal, which we'll get to in a second, but also during this period of time, we see America suggesting a new policy in Asia for China. We suggest the open door policy, Secretary Hay does, which proposes that no single country should have a monopoly of trade over China to kind of end the spheres of influence and allow all countries to trade with China. And so we ask the Europeans to consider this. Okay, Roosevelt continues to flex his muscle as president to basically impress Japan and the rest of the world. Roosevelt decides to send our entire new fleet of battleships all around the world, which doesn't sound like a big deal today, but back then it was a major deal. Most countries couldn't do that. In fact, most countries today can't do this. And so we send our fleet known as the Great White Fleet because they were painted white, and our ships go around the world, stopping from port to port and flexing good old American muscle and showing that the United States can project power. And so it's a smashing success and an excellent achievement for our Navy. Here's a picture of it. A lot of coal there. Okay, like I was saying before, the Panama Canal Roosevelt is perhaps most famous for. Roosevelt, almost through sheer will, gets the Panama Canal built. Panama was part of Colombia. We offer Colombia some money to build this canal. The Colombians say no. We have the Panamanians declare independence, start a little revolution, and we stop the Colombians from stopping the revolution. So we basically allow Panama to become an independent nation so that we can build our Panama Canal, which this political cartoon kind of references by us, by Roosevelt digging the Panama Canal and then chucking dirt on the capital of Colombia. Okay. Anyways, there's a map of the Panama Canal. And that's all I have for you today, guys. Go ahead and follow me on Twitter. My website's right there. Email me any questions at my YouTube channel. Thanks, guys. Hopefully this helped.